Good evening and welcome to the Door County Master Gardeners Educational Series. I'm Sue Kunz, a member of the Education Committee. Those of you in the Crossroad audience, if you would please be sure to silence your phones. For those viewing on Zoom, please enter your questions in chat. We will have a Q&A at the end of the program. We would like to thank the Door County Medical Center for sponsoring our programs this year, our collaborative partners, Crossroads at Big Creek, and the Door County Seed Library, and an additional recognition to Corey, our fabulous technical support person. Tonight's guest speaker is Janell Wehr, a horticulture educator with UW-Madison Extension for Marathon and Wood counties. In her talk, Heirloom Biographies, Janell will explore different varieties of vegetables, from the father of the modern tomato to Wisconsin Beaver Dam peppers to Picha tomatoes. Janell likes to say, "I grow gardens for a living." Please give Janell a warm welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Janell Wehr. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. And bear with me one quick second, and I'm going to share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. And so, yes, tonight I'm here to share with you about different vegetable varieties, but I'm really hoping that we get out of tonight's program is to learn about some of the different common vegetables that are grown in Wisconsin backyards and really gain maybe a little bit deeper appreciation for the wide variety and diversity that garden vegetable plants historically had in our backyard gardens. And then also walk away with a good understanding of the difference between open pollinated plants versus hybrid plants. And so we will go ahead and jump in because I've got a lot to share with you this evening. So again, we're going to go through those heirloom stories, and then I'll walk through what is the difference or what are the definitions of heirloom, open pollinated, hybrid, and we'll touch a little bit on GMOs. And I got a fun little story to share with you about GMOs in the United States. So the first story I want to share with you is about AW Livingston. He was the father of the modern tomato. But before we go too far into AW Livingston's story, we need to back up and just talk a little bit about where tomatoes came from, and how they were bred. So tomatoes are native to the North and South American continents, but they were really only cultivated in Mexico and Central America. They were introduced into what is now the United States by the Spanish through Florida and New Orleans. And then slowly over time, they made their way into the United States. Even as late as the 1830s, tomatoes were still considered poisonous by folks who lived in the northern states. And this is going to include northern Ohio. Even after it was understood that tomatoes were not poisonous, most people still didn't care for the look or the smell or the flavor of tomatoes. Joseph T. Buckingham, who was the editor of the Boston Courier at the time, is quoted as calling tomatoes the mere fungus of an offensive plant, which one cannot touch without an immediate application of soap and water, with an infusion of eau de cologne to sweeten the hand. Tomatoes, the twin brothers to soured and putrescent potato balls. Deliver us, O ye caterers of luxuries, ye gods and goddesses of the science of cookery, deliver us from tomatoes. So clearly, tomatoes were not cared for, at least when they were first cultivated in what is now the United States. So 1830 or 1834 comes along with tomato mania. 1834, Dr. John Bennett published that the tomatoes were a cure-all. So, nowadays, maybe goji berries or kale or, every couple of years, this new miracle food that if we eat it, we're going to be healthy. That's not a new phenomenon. This goes all the way back at least to the 1830s with the tomato mania. So Dr. Janet Bennett, he publishes, and if you look on their page here, we've got an advertisement here for tomato pills. So Dr. Mill's compound extract of tomato. These pills were advertised to cure indigestion, headaches, fevers, ulcers, hepatitis, complaints of the liver, and congestions. And they even suggested these tomato pills would be fantastic for children's medicine to cure summer complaint, whooping cough, and measles, as well as a bunch of other what we now consider as childhood diseases. So it was estimated that about 100,000 people throughout the country were taking these tomato extract pills. Um, but guess what? People were still sick, right? The tomato pills didn't actually cure the folks. And so by the time the 1840s came along, these tomato cures were reported as hoaxes. But even still, the tomato mania really expanded the culinary use of tomatoes. So now tomatoes they're being used a little bit more in cookery, in recipes and things. People are experimenting. Really took off during the Civil War because tomatoes were canned and then used by camp cooks. And then after the Civil War, the canning industry expanded exponentially. Up to this point, the varieties really truly hadn't improved very much. And so, beginning in 1848, Livingston starts attempting to improve tomato varieties. Okay, now remember 1848. Through plant selection, he would eventually develop Livingston's Paragon. This would be his first tomato that he patents. But the Paragon, the fruit was larger than many of the standard tomato varieties at the time, and it was more uniformly smooth. According to Livingston himself, he said he advertised it as it was the first perfectly and uniformly smooth tomato ever induced to the American public, or so far as I have ever learned, first introduced to the world. So he was obviously pretty excited about the Paragon. This would soon become the favorite tomato for market growers and canners. Now, Livingston would continue to develop new tomatoes, and his company would eventually develop. So even after he passed away, his company would continue developing tomatoes. Himself and his company would develop a total of 31 varieties. He constantly worked to develop a tomato that would ship well. And so it needed to have thicker skins, but it also needed to have uniform roundness and flavor. When he died on November 11th of 1898, the Elmer Times gave this tribute. They said, he would never be forgotten in the scientific agricultural world as the creator of the modern type of large, smooth tomatoes, which supersede the repulsive, twisted tomats of our grandfather's time. His sons would continue to develop tomatoes under the company name, and this would eventually lead to the Rutgers tomato, which in 1952 represented 72% of all the commercially grown tomatoes in the United States. And so what we've got here is we've got starting with the Paragon tomato. Now remember, I told you he first started working on the Paragon tomato in 1848. It wasn't until 1870 that the genetics were stable enough that he had bred a tomato and stabilized the genetics to be able to release these seeds out on the market. So from the Paragon, he then breeds the beauty and favorite together, and they become new stone. He breeds his new stone with Henderson's Ponderosa to develop the Globe in 1897. With the Globe, he uh, bred it with a French tomato called Marvel, and that would lead us to the Mariglobe in 1917. And this Mariglobe was bred with the JTD. Now, Campbell's Soup originally wasn't called the Campbell's Soup Company, or yes, it was not called the Campbell's Soup Company. They were canning different things, but they weren't working on condensed soups as kind of their main brand. But they would develop this JTD was actually, and I can't remember, these are the initials of a gentleman that really started the condensed soup section of the Campbell Company. And so, as an honor to him, and I believe it was tomato soups that he was canning as condensed soup, that really kind of shifted gears to the Campbell Company. And so, because of that, the Campbell Company bred and grew this tomato. They named it after the person that really kind of got them going in the soup world. And so, Livingston. Or the Livingston Company, or actually, I apologize, it wasn't the Livingston Company, it was Rutgers University. Rutgers University would breed the JTD tomato with the Mariglobe, named the tomato after the university, Rutgers University. And like I said, by the time we got into the 1952, that Rutgers tomato represented 72% of all of the commercial tomatoes that were available. So the reason why this story in AW Livingston really kind of caught my attention when I was doing some research for this program originally was I got to thinking about how tomatoes are so fundamental to when we think about American food. Tomatoes are really fundamental with that. First thing I started thinking about is, how in darn near every town and city, but even the small towns in the United States have a pizzeria. I don't know if we would have pizza in the United States if it hadn't been for Livingston and his work and developing a tomato that not only was a uniform tomato, but also something with a thicker skin that would travel well, so that way it could make it to the canneries and be utilized in not just a backyard kitchen, but in commercial kitchens as well. Okay, so that was A.W. Livingston. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about the Sheboygan tomatoes and Dr. Jeff Nicola. So the Sheboygan tomatoes come to us by way of Lithuanian immigrants in the Sheboygan area. These have been grown since at least the early 1900s in the Sheboygan area. And it's a paste tomato, and it's known for having really great flavor. So in my picture here, we've got a juvenile. It's not quite ready. It's not quite ripe yet. We've got a Sheboygan tomato, so you can kind of see that it's a paste tomato. Now, it was first introduced to the Seed Saver Exchange by Dr. Jeff Nicola, who was a member at the time. Dr. Jeff Nicola served on the board of advisors for the Seed Saver Exchange. And some of you over in Door County actually may be familiar with either Dr. Jeff Nicola or some of the work that he has done, because he ran a huge heirloom plant sale that funded research at UW Green Bay. And this, as far as I know, this heirloom plant sale continues now. He has since moved on. For a while, he was in New Mexico at the University of New Mexico. And last I was able to find him, or just to kind of see what he was up to. Last I found him, he was in the Czech Republic as a professor of ecology. I did reach out to the Seed Saver Exchange actually for a few of these stories because they're great about and not only maintaining heirloom seeds, but as well as some of those seed stories that go with them. So I reached out to them and I was asking, hey, as I'm looking around and doing this research, I just keep seeing his name popping up as being fundamental in making sure that these seeds and these varieties are passed on through the seed saver exchange. But he was going out and looking for all sorts of peppers and tomatoes and just all sorts of vegetable varieties. They were not able to tell me how many different cultivars of plants that he had shared over time with their seed exchange or other seed exchanges, but I can tell you it's a lot. They were be able to tell me, though, that just in garlic varieties alone, he introduced 350 garlic varieties. So that's why I wanted to highlight him in particular. He's quite the seedsman, or maybe heirloom seed saver. Okay, now we are going to jump and talk a little bit about Beaver Dam peppers. If you haven't grown Beaver Dam peppers, they are fantastic. I highly recommend growing them. So the story with the Beaver Dam peppers, at least in Beaver Dam, starts with Joe Hussely. And I apologize, these Hungarian names, there's two Hungarian names here. I might end up butchering them. I apologize for that in advance. So this story starts with Joe Hussely. He was an Hungarian immigrant, and he brought these pepper seeds with him when he emigrated to the Beaver Dam area in 1912. And here on the slide here, I've got a picture of Joe Hussely. This picture's from about 1952. So he first arrives in the Beaver Dam area in 1912. He and his immediate family came through Ellis Island, and eventually they settled in southeast Wisconsin. And as the story goes, he brought the seeds in his pockets because he loved the peppers so much. Locals and descendants of friends of the Hussely family like to say that the Hussleys planted the seeds, grew the peppers, and shared the seeds with friends and neighbors, setting up this little community of Beaver Dam pepper, setting up a little community of Beaver Dam pepper growers who appreciated this delicious plant's mild bite enough to pass the seeds down for generations. Now, it wasn't just Joe who brought these pepper seeds over. If you look into the story, usually you'll hear about Joe bringing the peppers over. Anna Cesiak isn't always mentioned, so I wanted to make sure that I mentioned her in the story too. She emigrated from Hungary in 1920, so about 8 years after Joe. When she got here, she was only 15 years old, and she made it. She was only 15 years old when she made it to Beaver Dam. Now she carried the seeds, a brass cookie mold, and a handful of other items. 1,300 miles when she left. I'm going to try this. Verschmert, Hungary, and then she made her way on foot to Charbroux, France, where she boarded a ship for America. She had not seen her father or her stepmother for over 9 years when she finally got to Beaver Dam. And then as she settled in, she found a close-knit community of Hungarian families, including the Joe Hussely family. And so the heirloom Beaver Dam pepper was brought to the United States by the Joe Hussely family in 1913, and he came from the same Baranghang region of Hungary that the Cesiak family came from. So, if you haven't heard, the Beaver Dam area has a fantastic festival where they celebrate Beaver Dam peppers. The festival um, is typically held in September. And last I had looked, it was at the Park Village shopping centers where the festival is held. So why in the world would Beaver Dam decide to have a whole festival around this particular pepper variety? Well, some time ago, the Beaver Dam Chamber of Commerce posted on their Facebook page about the Beaver Dam pepper, um, and that the pepper was named after the city of Beaver Dam. So some people posted that they knew about it, but apparently it was still a little known secret with just within the community. And so when local citizens discovered that the Beaver Dam pepper was celebrated in cities throughout the Midwest, but not in Beaver Dam, they decided the time was right to go ahead and bring that celebration back home. One of the places where the Beaver Dam pepper was celebrated is actually in Chicago too. So some of the things that they have at the festival, they have a longest pepper contest, a pancake breakfast. They've got lots of food and vendors, a chili cook-off competition. They'll have pies for sale, and of course, music and square dancing. It's kind of your classic Wisconsin festival. So if you get a chance in early September, definitely go check it out. So a very good time. Oh, and I just want to say I've grown beaver dam peppers quite a few times. It's, ooh, I really love chili peppers. I would say it's in my top 10 favorite peppers. And the cool thing about beaver dam peppers is they're not, I wouldn't say there's like at the Scoville units level of a jalapeno. It's a bit milder than that. Um, but they start off really sweet and then they slowly build up a little bit of heat on the back end. But like I said, if you don't really like spicy, you might still like beaver dam peppers because like I said, they're not particularly spicy. I don't remember the Scoville units, but I know jalapenos are like around 3,000, so they're going to be less than that. All right, this next story is a favorite of mine. We're going to talk about fish peppers. And this story really, it's kind of centered on African Americans and bees. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of the story, I want to talk first. Well, first of all, I just want to mention these the variegation, the foliage and the variegation of these peppers is so incredibly ornamental. I think these would be fantastic to grow just inside pots, or maybe in pots in combination with some other plants. I could see this looking gorgeous with maybe wave petunia, something that's going to spill out of a pot, or maybe bacopa would be gorgeous too. And I really, I have a soft spot for beautiful variegation. So I just wanted to point that out. These are very ornamental as well as useful culinary. So fish peppers were believed to have originated in the Caribbean, and they traveled to the Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Chesapeake region. That's really where they have been cultivated and grown over a long period of time. Some food historians think that they probably arrived with Haitians right around the time of the Haitian Revolution. And so that would have put us at around 1791 to 1804, just so we've got that time period. So fish peppers were cultivated by enslaved African Americans and freedmen. The peppers were used to ease joint pain and inflammation, to treat intestinal worms, to deter bugs from tobacco plants, as well as to spice up bland diets. Enslaved people also would rub hot peppers on the bottoms of their feet if they were when they were seeking freedom. The idea here is that the hot pepper smell on their feet would throw off bloodhounds that were on their trails. And on plantations, enslaved people could earn money and sometimes even their freedom by tending to vegetable patches and then selling the produce. And so fish peppers would often be part of the produce that they would sell. When I mentioned bland diets, a lot of, thinking this is the Chesapeake Bay area, right? And so a lot of their diets are going to be fish stews. And some of those stews were cream based. And so what they would do is the way the fish peppers ripen is they'll start off this really pretty kind of a green color and slowly the white um, I don't know the right word for it, variegation or but this white coloring will slowly kind of get larger. And what they would do is they would pick the peppers while they were still in this stage. They wouldn't let them turn. Uh, Eventually it'll turn orange and then it'll turn a real pretty bright red color. They wouldn't use them as they were ripening. They would use them unripened while they were still kind of a green and a cream colored, and they would add those to the fish stews, and especially fish stews that were cream based or fish soups that were cream based, they would add it to them. The idea being that this coloring, they could add a little bit of spice and a little bit of flavor and a uh, pepper to it without muddying the color of the stew or the soup, especially with those cream-based soups. If they added the red peppers, that would muddy the color of it. And it actually kind of became a bit of a secret ingredient, because you wouldn't necessarily be able to see the peppers in there. Okay, so that's fish peppers. Now we're going to talk about Horace Mann. So Horace Mann was a famed African American artist. He was from Westchester, Pennsylvania, and he suffered from arthritis from a World War I injury. And so in the early 1940s, a common cure for arthritis was an inflammation in general, would have been utilizing bee stings as a remedy. And so Horace Mann, and so this is Horace Mann pictured, and this is Horace Mann pictured here. And this is one of his paintings. Like I said, he's a famous American painter. Or he was a famous American painter. And so in the early 1940s, he's looking for bees so that way he can use the bees to sting himself to relieve some of that inflammation and the arthritis. And so he befriends Ralph Weaver. Now, Ralph Weaver is, he's a white gentleman. He was a white gentleman, and he had a passion for rare plant varieties. And he kept this huge kitchen garden, and he was also a beekeeper. And so Horace Pippin would trade Ralph Weaver seeds of different plants for bees, and fish peppers were one of the plants that he traded. And so, uh, like I said, Weaver was a collector of different, he collected all sorts of, as many different types of varieties of plants and vegetable plants and fruits and things like that. He was kind of, I guess, maybe an original seedsman or an original modern seedsman. So Weaver, he stored his seeds in a chest freezer. He knew that by keeping them cold, their viability would last longer. And so in 1966, about 10 years after his father died, I'm sorry, not his father, about 10 years after Ralph Weaver dies, his grandson, William Boyes Weaver, and this is him over here. This is William. So this was the grandson of Ralph. So William's going around in the homestead and he finds these seeds. Uh, And he decides, you know what, I'm going to try to grow them, see if they're still viable. And they were viable, or at least many of the seeds that he found were viable, including the fish peppers. And so in 1955, so William discovers the seeds in 1966, and apparently he catches the bug that his grandfather has because from 1966 all the way until 1995, he's continuing to grow and share these seeds with people. And in 1995, he offered them to the Seed Saver Exchange. Now, here's the thing that really gets me excited and warms my heart. Since then, so since 1995, they have regrown in popularity in the Chesapeake Bay area, especially with Black farmers who connect with the pepper's history. William Boyce Weaver is another important seedsman, and he's a food historian. And he wrote this book that, if you're interested in hearing more about stories, you may want to check out this book, The Heirloom Vegetable Gardening. He talks a little bit about growing the plants and the cultural needs that they'll have, but also the history and connecting that history and the economic importance that these plants have had in the past, and making sure that we know these seed stories. All right, we're coming back to Wisconsin. So here we're going to talk about the Lorenzo Trussoni heirloom sawflower. So here we've got an Italian heirloom sawflower that is from the Trussoni family from Vernon County, Wisconsin. Marilyn Loom grew it for at least 35 years before she shared the seeds with the Seed Saver Exchange in 2015. So she got the seeds from her grandfather, Lorenzo Trussoni. Lorenzo left Italy in 1889 when he emigrated from Francisco in I'm going to try, in the Capodolcino region of northern Italy. He was in his early 20s when he left his home country, and like many, many of the immigrants that came to the United States, he left home because he was looking for work. He was looking for um, economic prosperity. And so he makes his way first, he made his way to Wisconsin and he found employment up in northern Wisconsin as a logger. And he slowly saved money until he was finally able to buy a farm near Genoa, Wisconsin, where there's going to be other Italian immigrants there. So there's a bunch of other Italian families in that area. So Marilyn was Lorenzo's granddaughter. And so her earliest memory of the safflower is having to go out in the garden and pick it as a child. A nasty job as far as I was concerned, since the inner leaves surrounding the flowers had barbs, hard barbs that really hurt. The dried safflower anthers are used in a risotto type dish, and they call it risotto with a hard T, risotto. And this dish is typically prepared for the holidays or weddings or wonderful events like that. It's made from long grain rice and cheddar cheese because the cheddar cheese was more readily available for them. Marilyn's mother made risotto for the holidays and then special occasions. Today, the safflower is grown not only by the Trussoni descendants, but by a lot of the Italian American community that's in and around Genoa. Marilyn says that the people in the Genoa region hold it very dear as it's a link to Italy and relatives there, part of our heritage we don't want to lose. The St. Charles Borromeo Catholic Church in Genoa hosts an annual reunion picnic over the 4th of July holiday, and risottos are made with the dried threads of this flower are featured prominently at their meal. The dried flower petals were used as a saffron substitute by the Trussoni family. Okay, we're staying in Wisconsin. Now we're going to talk about the pica potato. And so this potato, pronounced pica. So this heirloom variety, potato variety, has been handed down within Sandy Pica Knapp's extended family up in Canada. So the family story goes that the potatoes were originally grown by John Pica Sr. in the early 1900s near Steuben, Wisconsin. He moved to Canada and he took the potatoes with him during the journey, but the story almost ended there. Um, as he was on his journey, he ate most of the potatoes. But when he arrived at his destination, he still had a few left, and so he planted what was left. Um, so John settles in Canada. He gets married, and he has six sons. One of the six sons, Albert, continued to grow the potatoes. So, fast forward in time, Sandy and her husband, Don Knapp, have been growing these potatoes near Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, since about 2008, when they received the tubers from Sandy's relatives in Canada and were able to bring the potatoes home again to Wisconsin. The Knapps shared the variety with the University of Wisconsin, UW Madison, which put the potatoes in its tissue culture program just to make sure that they eradicated any of the viruses present. The Seed Saver Exchange received the virus free seed potatoes in 2019 from UW Madison. The dark purple skins are scattered with gold coloring. The flesh is cream. The tubers range between 2 and 4 inches long. They're kind of on the small side though. They tend to be right around half a pound. They're starchy with average flavor, but the Seed Saver Exchange in 2019 grew them, and they found that they were one of the most productive. They found that they were one of the most productive varieties grown at their heritage farm where they do their trial plantings. Before we jump into the next one, I just want to take a quick drink. I can turn my mute off so you don't have to listen to me. Apologize for that. Just didn't want to start sounding like a frog on you. All right, next we're going to talk about the Chimayo landrace pepper. So this one, I'm taking us out of Wisconsin. I'm going to share with you a pepper that's near and dear to me personally. So before we go into the Chimayo landrace pepper, I want to make sure that we're all working with definitions that we're familiar with, or working with the same definitions. And so I want to define, what does it mean to be landrace? So a land race is a domesticated, locally adapted, traditional variety of species. And so it could be an animal. So we could have land race pigs or cattle, as well as plants. Um, the key thing here for it to be a land race, though, is it needs to develop over time, like long periods of time, um, through adaptation to its natural and cultural environment. So both agricultural, and it needs to be isolated from other populations within the same species. Okay, so really we're talking about something that really didn't get a chance to breed with anything else in its species for a very long period of time. And I'm talking, potentially hundreds of years being isolated. So Chimayo is this really small town. The census stated it was, I found the census stats for 2010. It was 3,177 people. So it's still a really small town. Hasn't grown that much over time, and it was much smaller way, way back in time. It's in northern New Mexico. So Chimayo is going to be, if we just go just north of Santa Fe, here's Chimayo. All right. Oh. Um, Chimayo is this really small town. What it does is there's a reason why they've got it on the map there. It is home to El Santuario de Chimayo, which is a small shrine which attracts over 300,000 Catholic pilgrims each year. And in fact, it's the largest pilgrimage that happens on the North American continent. And so uh, I found that to be kind of interesting. Just that's the reason why it's well known, really, really well known. But before the Spanish got there, the Pueblo Indians have inhabited the Chimayo area since at least the 12th century. The Spaniards got there around 1540. So the Chimayo is one of several local descendants of the first chili peppers, believed to have been brought to the region by the Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century, sometime in the 1500s. Um, Now, these peppers, they ended up being isolated. So there was an original first chilies that arrived in the area, and then they were isolated agriculturally in these little rural pockets. And as they became isolated, um, number one, the chilies took on the names of the local pueblos. That they were grown at. So you're going to find chilies named Santo Domingo, Nambe, Cañoncito. And so these are all different remote pueblos. And over time, they were traditionally grown there. And they have really become they've long been an important part of the local diet and cuisines. Um, the local diets and cuisines of both the Hispanic communities and the Native American communities in those areas. Their isolation contributes to their varying and very unique flavor profiles. Now, of the pack of all of the different chilies that are in these little isolated pockets, these different little land-raised chilies, um, the chimayo is considered by many to be the crown jewel. Now, you may be familiar, New Mexico is known for their chilies. Um, in fact, I think the state's main conversation is it red or green or Christmas. And Christmas means that you want both red and green chilies on whatever, or red or green chili sauce on your enchiladas or whatever the meal is going to be. You may be familiar with the hatch chilies. Hatch chilies actually have been traditionally grown in southern New Mexico. And so hatch chilies are incredibly important economically. So I just wanted to make sure that I made that clear that the hatch chilies they are, there's definitely much more hatch chilies that are grown than the Chimayo chili, but the Chimayo chili is considered the creme de la creme. In fact, it's known as like being one of the best flavorful chilies, especially for making chili powder. In fact, it's one of the most expensive one, and so a pound of Chimayo chili peppers will get you about $45. A ground chili pepper will get you about $45 a pound. Now, this is going to be really similar to, say, champagne in France versus sparkling wine in the United States. If don't, I want to make sure we're not going to get confused and think we can make a whole ton of money this year by just growing a bunch of Chimayo peppers. For them to be really catching that $45 a pound price tag, they've got to be grown in the Chimayo area. Just like I said, for champagne to be called champagne, it's got to be grown in the Champagne region in France. Same idea here. So Why is this such a meaningful pepper for me? Well, my great grandmother and my second great grandmother, both of them hail from Chimayo, New Mexico. And so a few years ago, actually, it's been quite a few years ago, it was back in 2020. Back in 2020, I happened to find a seed company that sold pepper seeds online, and I grew them, and they were fantastic peppers. They were really good peppers. And I have to say, it was incredibly rewarding to grow a plant, to grow a crop that I know my ancestors grew. Um, you know, many, uh, many decades ago. Here we've got some examples of what the Chimayo peppers look like. So here's one ripening, and then here we've got them. And like I said, the Chimayo peppers kind of looks like a hatch chili, but the flavor profile is going to be a little bit different, and you're going to find some different structures to it. Like I believe that the seed walls, or not the seed walls, but the the fruit walls, the seed walls of the Chimayo peppers are much thinner than the hatch chilies. Hatch chilies, the New Mexico extension actually worked with the local growers. I want to say this was back in the 1950s to develop the big Jim pepper. And then from there, they did really just continue developing lots of different types of chili peppers, hatch chili peppers. And its hatch chilies have really become incredibly economically important for New Mexico. All right, so this is going to be the last of my seed stories for this evening. And I'm not going to pronounce the squash correctly. But so we've got the Giti, Giti Okosoman squash. Now, back in the height of this story was around 2015 and 2016. So you may have seen the story, and you may have seen it since then, but that's when the story was really, really popular. I took a screenshot of one of the news articles about this squash. Um, so the way the story goes is the squash is 800 years old. Um, and so basically, what they were suggesting, or what the news organizations were saying, was there was an archaeological dig on the Menominee Reservation, and this dig led them to find an 800-year-old clay vessel, and this vessel had seeds inside of it. And so, when the researchers grew the seeds, this squash grew. That's unfortunately, or actually, fortunately, that's not, it's unfortunate because disinformation got out there. Um, and actually, the real story is so much more interesting and richer. And I think it's got I think will tell us a little bit about not only ourselves, but the power of growing and caring for heirloom plants. So the real story is that these seeds have been handed down through generations through the Miami Nation in Indiana. It's estimated that the Miami Nation have been growing these peppers, or I'm sorry, not peppers on the brain, have been growing these squash and protecting them and keeping them from getting cross-pollinated for as long as 5,000 years. And so, if anybody has ever grown squash, you know that they're easy to cross pollinate. And so the Miami have been careful to hand pollinate them and maintain their purity. So, how in the world did this crazy story about archaeologists digging up this clay vessel, how did the wires get crossed here? Well, the Miami Nation of Indiana gave seeds to a UW-Madison professor. So there is a little string of truth here. The professor's name was David Rohn. And and he collected seeds, kind of like Dr. Jeff Nicola out of UW Green Bay. This UW-Madison professor collected seeds from all sorts of different types of, or all sorts of different people. He also, at some point in time, received seeds from a cave in Kentucky in the 1990s. Somehow these two stories morphed, and unfortunately, the news media ran with, they didn't check the story very well, and they ran with the miscommunication. Good news is these seeds are now available. I'm not positive if Seed Saver Exchange has them available yet, but I know the White Earth Nation out of Minnesota, they have a seed exchange, and those seeds are available through them. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about definitions. As a UW Extension educator, I always have to bring a little bit of science to it. But I hope that those seed stories were enriching, and I hope the collection I picked was interesting and maybe got you a little bit excited about not only the cultural significance of how, the plants that we grow and why we grow them, but also historically the economic significance of our different varieties that we grow. So, what is an heirloom? Now, we're going to talk about heirlooms, open pollinated, hybrid, and GMO. We're going to talk about those four definitions. Of the four definitions, heirloom does not have a scientific definition. The other three do. The other three, I could open up a biology book and I will be given the same definition from one biology book to the next, or at least have the same basic meaning. Heirloom, on the other hand, it's not a botanical word. So, what do we mean when we say the word heirloom? Generally, what we mean is we're talking about an old cultivar of a plant that was either used for food. Typically, it's used for food, but you will find some heirloom flower plants or heirloom ornamentals, right? You think about those heritage roses. So it's going to be an old cultivar of a plant that has been grown and maintained by gardeners and farmers, particularly in isolated or ethnic minority communities of the Western world. From the 16th century through the early 20th centuries, diversity was huge. We had so many different types of traditional vegetable gardens that were grown in backyards. If you went from one end of the county to the other end of the county, not everyone was growing the same varieties. A lot more diversity. um, Valuable and carefully selected seeds were sold and traded using catalogs. But because everything was open pollinated at that time, well, once you got your hands on a seed variety that you liked, if you were careful about making sure that it wasn't cross-pollinated, and you could save those seeds from one year to the next. And that's what the majority of people did up until up until really the 1940s. Since World War II, agriculture in the industrial world has mostly consisted of food crops that are grown in large monocultural plots. In order to maximize consistency, only a few varieties of each type of crop are grown in those commercial markets. In the backyard gardener markets, we've got quite a bit more variety, but even that variety has shrunk down by an incredible percentage. 75%. We've lost about 75% of genetic crop crop genetic diversity. So going back, when we were saving or when we were growing these plants, varieties were often selected for their and they still are selected for their productivity, their ability to ripen at the same time, while also withstanding mechanical picking and shipping across country. Remember, I told you that the Rutgers tomato was 72% of the commercial market in 1952? It would only stay at that point for a very short time before it was replaced by tomatoes that had a longer shelf life. The biggest thing is they had thicker skins because mechanical picking really took off after the mid 1950s. From that point on, we really needed Rutgers tomato wasn't really a good for the commercial markets anymore. Um, okay. So some folks use the definition of heirloom based off of either how old that variety is, or they'll just use a date. So some folks suggest that it needs to be 100 years old. Some will say 50 years old. Others will mark the year 1951 because that was the year that hybrids were introduced to the market. Now, another way to think of heirloom plants, and I think this is my favorite way of thinking about them, is to really define heirloom cultivars by using the definition of the word heirloom in the truest sense. And so here I'm thinking in this interpretation, I'm thinking a true heirloom is a cultivar that has been nurtured and selected and then handed down from one family member to another family member over generations. It really gets to the heart of what I think of when I think of heirlooms, not only varieties, but even objects that have been passed down through families. Now, most authorities, while they may not agree on the year or the date or those types of things, most authorities will at least agree that heirlooms must be open pollinated varieties. So, what is an open pollinated? What does that mean? Well, open pollination is when pollination occurs by an insect or a bird or the wind or any of the other natural mechanisms. And since there's no restrictions on the flow of pollen between the individuals, the amount of variation within plant populations, this is going to allow the plants to slowly adapt to local growing conditions and climate from one year to the next. So if you've been growing, this is the reason why if you grow an open pollinated variety in your backyard, over the course of time, you and especially if you're only, you're selecting for whatever you care about. So let's say I only grow open pollinated tomatoes, only one variety, and I'm really careful to protect it so that way it's not getting cross pollinated. Um, over time, that tomato, and then let's say I select for flavor or I select for size. I just want the biggest tomatoes I can grow. Over time, that if I'm selecting only the seeds from the very largest tomatoes, I will eventually have tomatoes that are extremely well suited for my soil in my backyard, climate in my backyard, or the microclimate that I have in my backyard, as well as what I'm looking for in those tomatoes. This you can only do with open pollinated varieties. We can't do this with hybrids, and I'll tell you why in a second. As long as that pollen is not shared between different varieties within the same species. So again, this is why I'm mentioning really protecting that, and why I think that the story of the squash that was handed down over 5,000 years, and knowing how the Miami Nation had to every single year, not even from one generation to the next, but every single year they had to really protect and make sure the purity of that fruit is not being cross-pollinated by anything else. That's to me, it's just such a powerful, powerful story. And so, as long as this pollen isn't shared between different varieties within that same species, the seed produced will remain true year after year. Remember that remain true because we're going to come back to that in a minute. So, what are the benefits of open pollination? Well, number one, you can save your seeds by selecting the best plants. That the best. I'm sorry, by selecting the best fruits from which to save the seed. Anyone can adapt a specific variety of strains to fit their region or microclimate. Another benefit is if you're saving your seeds, this is gonna be less expensive. Um, so for every hybrid that is grown, and we'll get into the definition of a hybrid in just a second, but just know that for every hybrid is grown, or for every hybrid seed, so I'm not really even interested in the fruits. I'm a seed catalog. I produce seeds. That's what I sell. And so for every hybrid seed that I sell, I have to maintain two lines of two distinct lines of genetics. And then I also have to do the whole production piece too of harvesting the seeds, drying the seeds, and then packaging them for sale and doing a germination test on them. So even if you're purchasing open pollinated seeds versus hybrid seeds, the hybrid seeds are going to be more expensive for the seed company to produce, and you can bet your dollars to donuts that the seed companies are going to pass on that expense to you as well. Um, Lastly, uh, let's talk about flavor. And so, few folks if you've had, especially if you're like me and you're a vegetable nerd and you've tried different varieties of tomatoes, maybe you have a favorite tomato variety. I probably, I got a lot of favorite tomato varieties, but off the top of my head, we'll pick on Brandywine as one of my very favorites. Um, if you grow heirloom vegetables, my guess is going to be you may do it for flavor in particular. That's the reason why a lot of folks grow heirloom vegetables. Many of the breeders who specialize in creating hybrid varieties for large scale commercial growers, they tend to focus on things that uh, are not flavor. So they're going to be looking at how well does it store? Is it uniform? And other characteristics that are really going to be important for processing. Um, can it be, how well does it stand up to mechanical picking, right? So since the onset of modern hybrid breeding, flavor really has not been a priority. However, now there's been a lot of new breeding programs that are taking flavor into great consideration when selecting and then refining those hybrid parent lines. And so, uh, all of this to say, I still grow my favorite heirloom varieties because I'm looking for that specific flavor that I've fallen in love with. But just know that there's also some really great tasting hybrid varieties that are coming out on the market now, too. Okay, so I talked a little bit about hybrid. Let's get a good working definition of what it means to be a hybrid. So, if open pollinated varieties are allowed to cross within the same species, so here I'm thinking Cherokee purple. It's a variety of tomato. It's open pollinated, and um, Brandywine tomato. It's another open pollinated tomato. If for some reason that they were allowed to cross, um, what we would have is a hybrid. And we could cross them ourselves. I mean, we could mechanically take a paintbrush into the flower. If I go into the Cherokee purple tomato and I cross that with a Brandywine tomato, I have now created a hybrid tomato. So hybridization is the controlled method of pollination in which the pollen of two different species or varieties are crossed by human intervention. Hybrids come from the careful and deliberate crossing of two different parent varieties, each with desired traits for the offspring. So typically, people, I think about AW Livingston and those years that he spent just perfecting the Paragon tomato, his first tomato, and then the decades once he's got started with the Paragon, the decades after that, I would say 60 years that him and his company were developing tomatoes. Um, and they were, originally Livingston was looking for uniformity in his tomato, right? So, what are some of oh, Um, the seeds from hybrids can be saved, but you need to know they will not be true to type. That means that in that example that I shared with you with the Cherokee purple and the brandywine tomato, if I cross them and I grow a tomato, I grow a plant, and it produces these beautiful uh, orange tomatoes, whatever reason, they're orange tomatoes. If I take the seed from that orange tomato, let's say I call it Orange Dream. If I take the seed from that orange tomato and I plant it, the fruit off of those seeds are not going to look like Orange Dream. They're going to look like some strange variation of the Cherokee purple and the brandywine tomato. That's what we mean by when we say that it doesn't remain true to type. It's not going to look like its parent. It's going to look like a combination of its grandparents. Okay. So, what are the benefits of hybridization? Why would anyone even want to bother doing this? Well, number one, we're going to have increased disease resistance. So this probably is one of the most important aspects of hybrid plants. So hybrid seeds are typically more resistant to a variety of different types of diseases. The reason why, in the most basic terms, is it's easier to breed disease resistance into a hybrid because you've got more control over what's happening than in an open pollinated seed. And then it goes without saying that this is going to be really desirable for home gardeners and commercial growers alike. Another benefit of hybridization is we get uniformity. So hybrid seeds offer unequaled uniformity. Commercial growers in particular desire consistency whenever possible. Think about growers and farmers, they are looking for, they don't want any surprises, right? If the crop is uniform and they all look exactly the same, it's going to be a whole lot easier to sell all of them rather than, the prettiest ones or whatever the market is looking for. So, hybrid seeds offer unequaled uniformity. Um, hybrids produce not only uniform plants, but also uniform fruits. And this can make cultivation more efficient as well as provide reliability and marketing that end product. Another benefit for hybrid seeds, hybrid plants, hybrid fruits is yield and vigor. So this is often called hybrid vigor. The hybrid vigor is a term that was coined by Charles Darwin in the 1880s, and it was used to describe the increase in overall vitality found in the offspring of two parent lines of differing genetics. Now, not all crops will demonstrate the effects of hybrid vigor, but for those that do, the benefits to the grower can be significant. Yields can double, growth rates can increase, seeds emerge more vigorously, and then plants perform better in adverse climate conditions. So, those are some of the reasons why we grow those hybrid plants. In the picture here, I've got Early Girl Tomato. She is a hybrid tomato. And as her name alludes, she was bred So she's a 57-day tomato. She was bred to be early. I can tell you from personal experience, I mean, she's not bad. I wouldn't spit her out, but she just doesn't have the flavor that some of those other varieties have. There's no free lunch when it comes to plant breeding. If you breed something in, you're probably going to be breeding something else out, right? And so in this case, a lot of times with those earlier tomatoes, we don't have quite the same type of flavor that we have out of those later producing varieties. Last, I want to talk about GMO. What does GMO mean? So, GMO stands for genetically modified organism. You may also hear use the terms genetically enhanced or transgenic organism. So GMOs can refer to either a plant or an animal that's got DNA that have been altered using a variety of genetic engineering methods. GMO is different than hybrid plants, okay? Or even open-pollinated plants that have been bred. Um, Here we are utilizing very specific tools, these genetic engineering methods, uh, not something that could be produced in nature. Plants, if you may be familiar, plants, especially certain types of plants, are incredibly adept at just naturally hybridizing themselves. But here we're talking about when human beings have been involved, and not just in breeding, but utilizing these engineering methods. It's important to know that GMO doesn't really refer to a single type of crop or a crop variety. When we're talking about GMO, we're really thinking about that technique or the tools used. And they can be used in a lot of different ways for different purposes. Sometimes GMOs are equivalently called genetically engineered crops. Transgenic GMOs have DNA from another species inserted into its genetic code. Cisgenetic GMOs have DNA that's a member from the same species. So that the transgenic GMOs, if you've ever heard of Roundup Ready corn, that's going to be a transgenic GMO. What they did was, I believe it was a bacteria that just happened to be naturally resistant to Roundup, or the active ingredient in Roundup. This bacteria uh, was resistant. And so what they did is they took the part of the genetic code that was responsible for the resistance to the active ingredient in Roundup, and they spliced it into corn genes. And what we ended up with is Roundup Ready corn. So farmers are able to apply an herbicide that will kill just about anything except for the corn. Um, there are other techniques out there that will either silence or they will turn off existing genes within a plant or within an animal. And in fact, I think that if I understand correctly, if you've heard about CRISPR as a genetic tool, and I hear that there's a lot of hope for genetic diseases in the future utilizing CRISPR. That's what they are doing is taking those existing genes and just turning off sections of them. Okay, so I have a picture here of petunias, and you may be wondering, why am I showing this picture of petunias? So back in another life, I worked as a greenhouse manager and a green good buyer for local to me. I'm not in Door County. I'm over here in Stevens Point, but a local to me garden center, a retail garden center. And so part of my job as being a green goods buyer is I'm always looking for, what is the new cool stuff that I can get from my vendors. And for a couple of years, I was bringing in these orange petunias. The variety that I was familiar with was African Sunset. There were some other orange petunia varieties too. So I can't remember what year it was. Now time's starting to get past me here, but I want to say it was probably or maybe around 2016, 2015, somewhere around there. no later than 2017. I know that much. So I had these orange petunias, these African sunset petunias. Oh, and the garden center that I worked for sold seeds as well, and we carried African sunset seeds. So it's spring. I'm going to say it was either late April, maybe early May. It's when things are really rocking and rolling in the greenhouse world. And we get an email one day from corporate, and they told us to immediately pull all of the African sun with seriousness, very very much seriousness. They said we needed to go and pull the African sunset petunia seeds off of the seed wall. Okay, what's going on? This is weird. We go and we pull the seeds, and they have us send them back to corporate headquarters because corporate headquarters had to destroy them. What the heck is going on? And so I don't know, maybe a week later, wasn't too much long after that, get another phone call or another email. If there are any if I have any living plants, any annuals, the African sunset, or any other orange petunias, I needed to take them and destroy them. And they gave me the instructions of double bagging them and putting them in the dumpster. They were beautiful plants. I was like, what are we doing here? So I went and did a little research, and I'd found that what had happened was over in Europe, I believe it was in Denmark, there was um, some sort of genetics. Some of the details of the story are starting to escape me because it's been a little bit of time. But there was a scientist, and he's walking into his genetics lab, and as he's walking through the front door, he happens to catch out of the corner of his eyes a container of flowers and it has orange petunias in it. That gets his hackles up. He goes, what the heck? So he goes and he takes the orange petunias and he brings them inside and he does some testing on them. And what he finds is they actually have some corn genes in them. They believe that the corn genes were responsible for that beautiful coral orange color that came out in these petunias. And so that set off alarm bells in Europe because in the European Union, they have very strict policies regarding GMO plants and animals. And so immediately everything had to be destroyed in Europe. No more orange petunias in Europe. And so then that information made its way across the pond over here to the United States. In the United States, it wasn't so much that, like the orange petunias weren't deadly, they weren't going to cause any trouble, but because they were technically a GMO and they hadn't been licensed through the proper channels, they weren't legal in the United States. And that's why there was a rush that year to get rid of all of the orange petunias, orange petunia seeds, and why you may not have seen orange, you may remember that there were orange petunias on the market and then they kind of disappeared afterwards. That's the story behind the missing orange petunias. Personally, I'm kind of hopeful that the breeders will go through the proper channels, and so that way we'll be able to get them on the market again. I do have to tell you that I was a little naughty. That year, I did get rid of most of the orange petunias, but I did take a couple plants home because I recognized that this was going to be the last time for a while that I'd be able to even look at orange petunias. All right. Well, that is all I've got for the prepared program this evening. Just wanted to mention, if you have any questions about tonight's program or really anything at all, feel free to reach out to me. I've got my email address listed on there. You can also find me on Facebook. I'm Janell Wehr hyphen extension, and that will get you. You can always message me or connect with me through Facebook. Otherwise, email is a great way to connect with me. And I am definitely free to take a few questions if anybody has any.
Gosh, Janelle, thanks. That was great. Does anybody in the audience have a question? Yes, Barbara.
I'm wondering where we can get some of those Beaver Dam pepper seeds or some of the other seeds you talked about.
do you know of a place where we could get any of the pepper seeds or any of the plants that you talked about? The Beaver Dam pepper seeds, the heirloom seeds?
Sure. So for the ones that I talked about specifically with the Seed Saver Exchange, those are all going to be available through the Seed Saver Exchange. So that would be one place that I would look. They have a catalog. They also have the exchange themselves. So if you really get into seed saving, I would recommend checking them out. But the catalog is available for anybody to purchase from. Beaver Dam peppers have become a little bit easier to get a hold of. So I'm going to share a source with you as an extension employee. I don't endorse products or companies, but I do know that at least up until last year, I haven't checked this year, but you should be able to get Beaver Dam peppers through Jung Seed Company. But honestly, I think you probably could find them through quite a few other seed sources too. And you can get the plants typically at least up until last year. I'm not sure what they're going to have this year, but you could get live plants if you are, happen to be traveling, like say if you're coming over to Stevens Point, typically, and I would call first, but the Jung garden centers typically have the plants as well as the seeds.
Okay, we have a Jung now in Appleton, so that's the closest Jung.
Oh, that's right.
Yes,
That's
yes,
right.
yes.
Yeah.
So,
So I would reach out, you know what, you could go ahead and call them. That's the company that I worked for in another life. It was very typical for people to reach out to me and call me and ask me, hey, are you going to have this variety? Can you pull 6 plants to the side? So I would definitely, if that's something that you're looking for, reach out to them.
all right, any other questions? Gosh, this was fabulous, Janell. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. It was a great evening for us. And you just keep growing those gardeners for us, okay?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you and good night.
Good night.